bottom. All right, so we're going to take a look at some other topics in the book of Esther that is not on Sunday morning. Last week, we looked at some of the additions that we found in the book of Esther. This screen, if you can see it okay, is one of those elaborate scrolls of Esther that have been printed out as it's used in the festival of Purim, the yearly Jewish festival. And so tonight, what I want us to do is talk a little bit about these two competing genocidal decrees and kind of ask the question in the back of our mind, is one of them just, or are both of them just, or is both of them unjust, that type of thing. So this is a topic that gets a little bit dicey when we consider the implications. So you should have a handout that has 2 pages of printed material, and on the last page, there are 2 slides that talks a little bit about just war theory. And so let's begin, first of all, with just kind of reminding ourselves of what we've already covered on Sunday morning. So we looked at chapter 3 of Esther, and we were introduced to Haman, who is kind of the villain of the story, and he is considered to be an Agite, which is a part of an ongoing enemy of the Jewish people. And he takes this personal affront by Mordecai, who will not give to him the homage that he feels he deserves. And he determines that he wants to exterminate not only Mordecai, but all the Jews as well. So he goes to King Ahasuerus in chapter 3, and we are told that he convinces the king to determine a date upon which the Jews will be exterminated. This date is determined by a casting of the lots, and in Hebrew, it's the word pur, and that's where we get the name for the festival of Purim. And the date for this genocide corresponds to approximately the same time of year that we're in right now. This particular decree was probably in the 5th year of Esther's reign as queen, and it was to be in the month of Adar, which corresponds to our month of March. So that kind of summarizes the first thing. In between all that, we looked on Sunday morning and saw that Mordecai uncovered a murderous plot against the king, and 2 individuals were executed because of it, and he was never honored. Esther goes into the presence of the king at a banquet, and she begins to unfold before King Ahasuerus that she's a Jew and that there's this decree that has been written against the Jews. And Haman is the individual who thinks he's in good standing with the king. And as a result of this, he misplays his position with the king. And what we find in chapter 5 is that Esther makes a request of the king, and she kind of puts off telling him what the problem is until a second day when there is a second banquet, and she invites Haman there. And then what we find is that the king had a sleepless night, and in order to kind of get himself back in a sleepy mood, he orders the reading of the chronicles of his reign, and he finds this passage where Mordecai saved his life. And so he asks this question in chapter 6, what should be done for an individual that the king honors? And so Haman speaks up and talks about leading him around the city, and he's on a royal horse with a royal crest and all this type of thing. And when King Ahasuerus says, well, let this be done for Mordecai the Jew, Haman is crestfallen, and he goes home, And his wife Zeresh tells him that this is only going to come to ruin because this man is a Jew. And in chapter 7, what we find is that when in the second banquet, Esther talks about this decree to kill her people, she names Haman as both an adversary and an enemy. And Haman ends up being killed on the gallows that he had built to kill Mordecai. That then brings us to chapter 8. And in chapter 8 and 9, in a reversal of fortunes, we find that Mordecai presents to King Ahasuerus a second decree to protect the Jews so that they could defend themselves, since the first decree was irreversible. And what we are told is that he words this decree in an interesting way. In chapter 8, it says in verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. Now, you might think that would be enough right there, that he could put a period after that. But it then goes on and says to also kill and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to put plunder to the property of their enemies. And so the same day, in the month of Adar, there is this second decree that allows the Jews to defend themselves. But in chapter 9, what we find taking place is that there is the execution of a number of people by the Jewish people. And it tells us that not only are Haman's sons killed in chapter 9, verse 7, and there's a bunch of names that I don't want to pronounce in verse 7 of chapter 9 because they're quite complicated. But then what we find is that they were to use this decree not only to protect themselves, but to also avenge themselves. And in chapter 9, what we're told, and this is what we're going to be covering this Sunday in our sermon in chapter 9, verses 1 through 19, we're told that initially in the city of Susa, 500 people were killed, but in the surrounding provinces, the Jews killed 75,000 people in the process. So this particular competing decree, if you will, allows the Jewish people to annihilate all men, women, and children. And that's where this kind of moral complexity comes into place. And the moral dilemma is, which decree is just? I would think that we would say the first decree that Haman proposed was unjust, because he takes his personal affront and he wants to obliterate all the Jewish people. This second decree, though, is often thought within Christian circles that they were only defending themselves. But I think if we look at the text closely, we'll find that it seems to go beyond the boundaries of self-defense. And that brings up a question that often comes up. Is this a just decree? Is this a just action on the part of the Jewish people in chapter 9? And I'm going to wrestle with that on Sunday morning. But a secondary question that comes up is, what are the conditions of war? So you have these two competing genocidal decrees. Is one of them just, one of them unjust? Are they both unjust? If so, why is that the case? Is it because it moves beyond self-defense, that type of thing? So you got to wrestle with these type of questions in the book of Esther. And so let me just kind of throw it out to you right now. Do you have any thoughts on this at this point before we move ahead? Because I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to probably why these decrees are written the way they are written. But You have any initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. It's the decree that Mordecai wrote sounds a lot like what God was saying to the Israelites when they were conquering the land. Yeah,
Yeah,
get rid of everybody.
yeah, that's a good observation. You're right.
We have to remember this is Old Testament. I don't
Mhm.
know, you know, the how many years past that it is,
Uh-huh.
but
That's a
the,
good
The other thing,
observation. Very good
the other
observation.
thing that's interesting is
get
he
closer.
in both cases, a couple times they basically reference saying, do not, even though we killed all these people, we did not take any of the spoils. You
Yeah,
know, so there's something peculiar about that, the way they emphasize that. And also then of course they impaled all of his kids,
yeah.
you know, which was sort of some sign of not I'm not quite sure what they were trying to symbolize, but
Hmm.
that was pretty um,
Pretty gruesome for sure.
gruesome. Yeah, I think obviously trying to send some kind of a signal. The other thing is that this 75,000 people is a lot of people. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
thing that even though they were large civilizations, um, in one swoop, literally, it sounds like it's a fairly short period of time to just kill that many people just seems like it's kind of a little. I mean, the reality is, this book, I think, as you know, I spent quite a bit of time this morning trying to look at the historical sides of this. It's
Mhm.
kind of a story. I mean, there's a lot of question in terms of, is this really fact? And I think most people lean to the direction, scholars that say it's not. This is a story that was created to justify the holiday, or whatever you want to call it, Purim.
Yeah,
And that's why some of this just seems a little bit,
it's over the top. Yeah,
over the top in terms of trying to send some of these signals. And because of that being over the top, it does sound a little. It makes it sound a little more fictional, if you know what I'm saying.
yeah, right. Now, that's a great observation that Bud has just made. And that is, are we dealing with real history here, or are we dealing with some political propaganda that's going on as well that serves other purposes? When you think about one day, 500 people being killed in the city of Susa and 75,000 people being killed throughout the rest of the provinces, that's astronomical in a day's time, so um there are some things here that I think help us to kind of figure out what is going on. It seems to me, first observation is that the decree of Mordecai is to kind of parallel and reverse the decree of Haman, so that the verbiage of the decree of Mordecai is to kind of be in symbolic manner, be exactly like the decree of Haman. So to kind of use an Old Testament parallel, we might say these decrees kind of work on the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth type of thing, where Mordecai's decree is intentionally written in such a way to kind of counteract Haman's decree. And it has that kind of lingo in it. Other thoughts on any of this before we go to the next slide? Yeah, so Mark just said, yeah, yeah, right. How do you kill 75,000 people in one day? Is that even possible considering the weaponry that would be used? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, well, let's move on and let's see. I think what's happening here is it is trying to continue this ongoing feud between two groups of people. So, yeah, yeah, I think that's part of it. And I think that the other thing is that this is something that has deep historical roots to it. So In chapter 3, as I mentioned before, Haman is referred to as an Agite. And this is probably a reference to the king Agag. And so I want you to turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, I think we get a little bit of an understanding of what is happening, not only historically, but also why we find that the Jews did not take any of the spoils of war. So in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, Saul is king, and what we find is that there is a command that is given by God in this chapter. So let's begin in verse 1. So Samuel the prophet is speaking to Saul the king, and he says, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So now listen to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Okay, so this story is going all the way back to the Exodus. And it's talking about the Amalekites as the nation of Israel is moving up toward the promised land, attack the Jewish people as they're en route. Then it says here that the Lord says, I'm going to punish this group of people for what they did back then. Verse 3. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Kill everything. Okay. But when you read chapter, that's not what Saul does. Jump down to verse 7. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But, it's a big but, verse 9. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. So they made a decision to keep the best of the spoils of the war. Now, what we find is that Saul has this excuse. If you jump down to verse 17, so Samuel confronts Saul and says, I hear the sound of animals. Whose animals are they? And then what we find, verse 17, Samuel says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites, make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? Then Saul gives this excuse, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission. The Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God. Here we go, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So they kept the best. He says, we were doing that to give sacrifice to God. So two things to observe. This is an ongoing hostility that goes all the way back to the Exodus. Then what we find is Saul is supposed to wipe out the Amalekites as a revenge for that attack, but he doesn't do so. Rather, he saves some of the spoils of war. And then later in the book of Deuteronomy, and we don't need to turn there, chapter 25, verse 15, Israel was not to forget, but was to blot out the name of Amalekite from under heaven. So what we find is this is an ongoing war between two groups of people. And what we find is if we trace down Mordecai's lineage, he is the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. And that tells us that he has an association with the tribe of Benjamin, which also means he has a kinship to King Saul. So you have Agag and the Amalekites, you have Saul and the Israelites. There's this deep root that's going on right now. But what we find taking place next is that it sets the stage for this ongoing conflict, of which the story of Esther is the most current expression of that. So when Haman writes a decree to wipe out the Jews, what is he trying to do? He's trying to finish off what his ancestors did not do centuries before. When Mordecai writes this decree, he's trying to finish off what Saul failed to do hundreds of years before. Does that make sense to everyone? So these decrees seem to be linked all the way back to the roots of the conflict between these two groups of people. So that brings us to this slide here. Now, we might say this is an understandable personal conflict based upon the history that these two men know that go all the way back to the past. So first point here, Haman's identity as an Amalekite would explain Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him. I'm not bowing down to a descendant of an Amalekite. Are you kidding me? There's no way a self-respecting Benjaminite would bow down to a descendant of an Amalekite. Now, Haman's reaction is understandable because old antagonisms die hard, right? So here is this man, Mordecai, that is continuing the ongoing conflict. Let's do away with this conflict once and for all. Now, Haman uses the opportunity, or at least he was going to before he was executed, to confiscate the property of all the Jewish people that he was going to kill, because he made a promise to King Mordecai, to King Ahasuerus, that he would deposit a certain amount of money into his treasury chest. So Haman is going to take all the spoils of war from this decree. So just on a side note here, we find even in the book of Daniel, which kind of predates Esther, because it talks about the Babylonian Empire. The Persians follow the Babylonians, but Persian law could not be altered. So once it was written in stone, and the only thing that could really happen is, depending upon how the decree was worded, a second decree might be able to invalidate it. And I think this is what King Ahasuerus was instructing Esther and Mordecai to do in chapter 8. So let's go back to the book of Esther. In chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, notice what it says. King Xerxes, again, Ahasuerus and Xerxes are the same person, replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So what happens here is he gives them permission to write a decree that will invalidate the first decree, but Mordecai writes a decree of great revenge. And I think kind of from Mordecai's point of view, this is an opportunity not just for self-defense. This is an opportunity to finish off what should have been done centuries prior. So the point of the new decree is to end this hostility that's been going on for years, and to finish off the Amalekites. Now, that does not, in my estimation anyways, give a justification for the decree. I'm just trying to explain probably what was going on in the thinking of Mordecai and Esther. So let me stop there and see if you have some thoughts, comments, questions. Anything? So basically, the second decree is a reversal of fortunes. Okay, so as the book of Esther reaches its climax in chapters 8 and 9, the Jewish people will turn a political defeat into a political triumph. And they will use this new decree in light of the fact that they have months to prepare, because that date was determined to be months later. So they have a chance to build up their own military forces between the time the decree is written and the date that is determined by lot. And so when the day comes for this supposed massacre of the Jews, which is about 8 months later, the Jews have had time to build up their defense, and they can kind of put a strong resistance against the anti-Semitic powers that they have dealt with for centuries, you know, all the way back to the time of Egypt. So it seems to me that Mordecai and Esther are taking advantage of the opportunity to kind of protect the interest of the Jews for years to come. So it's kind of a political thing that they are doing here, because once King Xerxes or Ahasuerus gives them the permission to write a second decree, the king has shown his hand now. He has shown that he's on the side of the Jews. And so they're going to take advantage of that and protect themselves for the upcoming years. So by the opening of the actual date of the war that's going to take place, these competing decrees, you find that the Jewish people and their power and the military that they build up was quite overwhelming. And in fact, I would say that chances are, without Haman being in the picture anymore, that any attack or persecution against the Jews probably would have been isolated. It probably wouldn't have been an empire-wide thing, because now the king is on the side of the Jews. There's this second decree. They've had time to build up their strength, that type of thing. So now the decree of Haman is only a possibility, and it might just be that individuals that were strong Amalekites that would still take this decree and try to put to death some of the Jews. It's unlikely, though, that Persians probably would have done so. If that second decree wasn't written, it could have been possible that the Persians would have followed the Amalekite lead, because it was a decree that was still in effect by the king. So that's a long-winded explanation, but I think it gives us a few possibilities here. And you'll notice the second point on this slide here, and that is there was no longer a question of real anti-Semitic assault. And if there were to be some type of resurgence of Haman's decree, it's more than likely Mordecai could have opted to arrest and execute a few hundred of those militia, and, you know, either killed them or have them arrested, have them tried under the king's court, because the king is now on the side of the Jews. Does that make sense? So any thoughts on that? So you can see kind of how dark this
Okay.
becomes in chapter 9 of Esther. 75,000 people killed, 500 in the city of Susa also. And you kind of go, was that necessary? And you can kind of see that dark side. And in fact, there are some Jewish people, conservative Orthodox Jews, that without the additions, so we talked about of Esther last week, without the additions of Esther, there had been many Jews that felt that the book of Esther should not have been a part of the canonical collection. Does that make sense? Because of this dark chapter in chapter 8 and 9 of Esther. Some thoughts there?
Any sense of what percentage of the total population the Jews were at this point?
Well, that's a great question, because a lot of them did go back under Cyrus' decree back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple. I don't know, but I can't answer percentage-wise what the population level would have been. I would venture to say one additional thought, though, is even if the Jews are not a high volume population in the Persian Empire at this time, it seems to me anyways, because of the writing of the second decree, that the Jews probably had the king's army at their disposal too. They would have followed that, the carrying out of that decree, and probably would have come alongside to help them.
The other odd thing that I think in this chapter where it says, and as a result of this, many people became Jewish. That just seems to be weird. I mean, I think of Judaism as ethnic, in a sense,
Yeah.
and not just religious.
Mhm.
And it just seems odd to me that potentially Persians would somehow become Jewish. I don't quite understand what that means.
Well, my own thinking on that is these people converted so that they wouldn't die, that
Yeah.
they were in fear of their lives. So I think I mentioned in Sunday's message that this actually turns into a crusade when during the Dark Ages, when crusades were going on, you had to confess Christ or die type thing. It seems to me to be a similar thing that's going on here. That's my only explanation of why some of these individuals would have joined the Jewish faith by becoming proselytes of Judaism. But, I do think in other sections of the Old Testament, there were Gentiles that became Jews simply because they felt the Jews worship the one true God. But I don't think that's the case here. I think the case here is it has to do something with the fear of these that felt that they would become refugees and would be hunted down. That's just my thoughts on it anyways. Yeah. Thoughts? Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know if you could hear Esther or not. She said, bow before the Jews, just like Haman wanted Mordecai to bow before him. That is a good parallel observation. It seems as though the way the book of Esther is written, that there's so many parallels, and these decrees are kind of in parallel as well with the first decree. So if it all started with Haman desiring Mordecai, and i.e. the rest of the Jews, to bow before him as a Amalekite, then this is a counteraction to that. I think that's a great observation.
So if you were to talk to Orthodox Jews or conservative Jews, what would they generally agree on in terms of this book being, in some sense, a story, or versus historical fact?
From what I've read so far in some of the Jewish commentators online in preparation for Sunday morning and stuff like that, it seems as though that most rabbis feel that this is a mixture of myth and fact and hyperbole, story mixed in with some personalities that all have kind of symbolic elements to it. I think it's probably only evangelical Christianity that wants to take this as pure history. In Judaism, there is the thought that this book is primarily trying to establish the importance of the festival of Purim, which is to celebrate the freedom of the Jews from foreign oppression. And Haman is the epitome of what an adversary, an enemy looks like. And so they use it as an opportunity to celebrate their freedom, celebrate the fact that they overcame so many times where they were oppressed and that type of thing. So I don't know, and I can't give you a percentage of Jewish rabbis that would take this as pure history, but I think that they would be in the minority. But most of them thinks that this is a mixture of story, tradition, principles of morality, different things like that. So that's a great question.
Was there a Queen Esther in history?
I don't know that there's any evidence that there was not. One of the topics that I want to touch on, and maybe we'll do this for next Wednesday night, is the question that comes up by Jewish rabbis that often question, was Esther a moral woman? So again, in Christianity, we tend to elevate Esther as a heroine. Within Judaism, there's great question about her mixed motives and why didn't she do certain things at a certain time that would have been a more advantageous benefit for the Jewish people. We'll talk about that. We'll try to talk about that next week. But my opinion is, yeah, there was an Esther, and yes, there was a Mordecai, and yes, there was a Haman, and yes, there was a King Xerxes. However, the way that they are portrayed in the book of Esther probably has some elements to it of embellishment, and it seems to me that the additions to the book of Esther that we talked about last week was to try to, I guess, justify Mordecai and Esther's actions a little bit because of the couple of prayers of Mordecai and Esther that are added there, as well as the full text of the decrees. So we only have kind of a summary of the decrees in the book of Esther, but if you look at those additions, those decrees are written out longer. Those are obvious editorial additions, but it seems to me that they are trying to justify what goes on in the canonical book of Esther and give to it, trying to justify it and establish it and give it credibility. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, Shelley. Yeah, I personally think that there probably were these personalities. I'm not sure that they're exactly the same as they're portrayed in the book of Esther, though.
I know they can trace some biblical characters back to real life, and I didn't know if they traced it.
I
don't
know without looking for that specifically. I don't know, but
some of the stuff that was in the different sources, I think there's the Persian Empire had some reasonable level of historical documentation. There's, I think, in terms of years and people. One source indicates that they can track every wife of Xerxes and Artaxerxes and that group, and Cyrus and all them, and that they can't find her. In other words, they know who was the queen
Yeah.
for different people at different times.
Yeah.
And so they really, from that, at least that write-up, they didn't seem to be able to, kind of a process of elimination. They were not able to find an Esther in there.
And that's certainly plausible that maybe Esther is a mythical character that is, trying to establish a line of I don't know what I want to say, kind of some line of connection to the deliverance from Haman, and that type of thing. Of course, there would be the question of whether Haman was a historical individual too. I guess we could ask that question too. But yeah, you're right. As far as extra biblical sources that establish Esther, really what we have is primarily what's in front of us, I think. Yeah. Right. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So what I don't know if you heard Esty, but she was talking about how in chapter 9, when the sons of Haman are killed, they're all named. And so there seems to be legitimacy to this lineage by the naming of these individuals. Esther is portrayed as an orphan girl who is raised by Mordecai. So the lineage element there is not stated in the book. But let's see if we can get a couple more things done here tonight. I know we're not going to get this whole page 3 done. So let's look at the next one here a moment. And I think this is a real important question. When the Bible sanctions violence, must we do so as well? There is a lot of violence in the Old Testament. And what we find is many times people cannot reconcile a God of love with the commands to exterminate the Canaanites, the Amalekites, different things like that, or even when God exterminates some of the Jewish people because they touched the ark or whatever it may be. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask, when the Bible sanctions violence, do we have to sanction it as well? If you take the Bible as a flat text, where every part of it is equally important as other parts of it, then you have the difficulty with trying to figure out how all of this violence plays in to the overall plan of God. And so that's why a lot of people don't like to venture into the Old Testament very much, because they run into these type of things where when you get to the New Testament, especially the Gospels, it's much easier to read about the life and ministry and miracles of Jesus. So I thought this is an important question, and the way you can break this question down has to do with first observation. Not all violence is regarded the same way in the Old Testament. So on your notes there, look, sometimes the Bible makes it unmistakably clear that certain actions are prohibited. They're wrong, they're sinful. I just pulled out a couple of examples here. When Cain kills his brother Abel, obviously that is condemned within the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. It's condemned. When David brings Bathsheba's husband Uriah back from battle so that he can cover up his own indiscretions with Bathsheba that leads to a pregnancy, He then sends Uriah to the front of the line, and we are told in 2 Samuel that Uriah dies in battle. And what we find is Nathan, the prophet, will confront David with this and said, David, you have really sinned by doing this against this lady's husband. Then there's other violence that seems to be considered virtuous in the sense that it is providing something better. Can I use that in quotations? Better than the killing itself. So I give you an example of the flood. In Genesis 6, Noah and his family are spared, but other people are exterminated because violence has basically covered the whole earth, which I find is a little bit interesting to think that God is going to remove violence from the face of the earth by violence. But nonetheless, the virtuous deed of it is start over and try to develop a different kind of society. The death of the firstborn in the Exodus provides the final reason that Pharaoh will let the Jewish people go. However, then you get to Joshua, which was mentioned by Shelley earlier this evening. And in the conquest of Canaan, is it really necessary to kill all the Canaanites in order to occupy the land? So what happens in the Old Testament is you have violence that is condemned, you have violence that's condoned, but here in Esther, you have violence that is celebrated. So so there's three kind of levels in the Old Testament. You have that which is condemned, that which is condoned, and that which is celebrated. So here's a follow-up question. Do we have the moral obligation to critique the assumptions in the Old Testament that violence is somehow virtuous? And my answer to that is yes. I think we have a moral obligation to critique the assumptions that were made by the people that did a lot of these atrocities, and then understand how civilization progresses forward to the time of Christ. And in Christ, we see, to use Greg Boyd's title in his book, we see the crucifixion of the warrior God. And in other words, rather than kill, Christ is willing to be killed as a display of love and forgiveness and salvation. So just a couple thoughts, and then we'll see if you have some questions, and then we'll close it up with this slide tonight. Thinking the Old Testament, we often are evaluating the incidents using our perspective as not as people that are victims under the circumstances. So we're standing apart looking back in on these stories, and we evaluate it and critique it based upon our own life experience and situation. If we were somehow to read these violent episodes in the Old Testament from the perspective of those that were victims under oppression and hatred and cruelty, would we be able to evaluate their response to this by aggression, by violence in a different way? So it's just a thought to go, if we were the Israelites in Egypt, would we have a different perspective on the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt in order to procure freedom? So it's just a way for us to kind of think. We can't just read from the perspective of those that are in power. We also have to read it from the perspective of people that were under oppression. Secondly, critiquing the violence episodes in the Old Testament does not necessarily render that text useless. So a lot of times what people do is they go, there's too much violence in the Old Testament. I'm not going to read the Old Testament. Well, that's why Paul, I think, he says, hey, all scripture is inspired. That's a whole nother topic in terms of letter for letter, word for word, or concept to concept. That's a whole different topic. However, but he does say the scripture is inspired and it is useful for a variety of things. So when he says that, he's expecting us, and not by us, he's expecting those that are his contemporaries to wrestle with the text. And consequently, that's what we do too. We wrestle with certain parts of the text, such as Joshua 6 through 11. And I think when you read those type of text, we can see how people that have long memories in the actual world where violence has been done to them as a people group justify their actions. And we see this in the Palestinians and the Israeli conflicts all the time. I mean, there's rarely a day where there's not something from the Middle East that hits the news cycle. And that goes back deep into history. And it also is something that these individuals, both Jews, Palestinians, and other Arabs, feel they are justified with attacking their enemy and adversary, that type of thing. But I do think to be a thinking individual, you have to critique even what is considered to be the virtuous violence in the Old Testament. How do you move beyond that? What can we learn from that? And how does it contribute to a healthier, more peaceful society? And that's what we wrestle with, I think, when we come to the text of the Old Testament. So I'm going to stop there, and we will pick up on page 3 next week. And if we get to Esther and her moral status next week or not, that's beside the point. But we'll definitely pick up on page 3 and 4 for next week. But let's close off tonight with any observations that you might have, any questions that you might have on what we've done so far tonight. Any thoughts?
I think you can bring the justification, so to speak, for violence, even down to a more personal level. If you know somebody who's had a family member murdered or anything, and you've seen the family members, they just want the other guy, something,
Yes.
they want justice for their,
Right,
their relative.
right. That's right. And that is an ongoing storyline too, isn't it? And that is when we see, and let's just take the whole Black Lives Matter movement, that's really kind of built upon all these unjustifiable deaths of Black men and women, and they're trying to reconcile this type of hatred and over violent expression toward them as a race, and then how do they get justice? And I think that's really what often fuels, and it's not right, but often fuels some of the rioting, even that we saw in downtown Cleveland, is the frustration that builds up because of a lack of justice, that type of thing. So in many ways, what we observed over the last year or so, we find is really the ongoing lineage of that type of animosity in some of the situations we see even in the Old Testament as well. Doesn't make it right on either side, but what I'm saying is, I agree, Shelley, that there's a desire for justice, and usually in our minds, we think that justice is punishment. That's usually what we equate it with. And so that could be physical and violent, or it could be, you know, some type of jail or prison sentence, that type of thing. Okay, Esty had a comment, so go ahead, Esty.
Nowadays, people that are oppressed, there's always violence attached somehow to it.
Mhm.
Either they're defending themselves or they are in home, or violence is done to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
This matter, that's pretty much just what I was thinking
Well,
as far as.
But there's other in the pronouns as well.
That's her being invading the.
Well, there you go.
Ottomans and the Turks.
Other thoughts, comments, questions that you might have? But I applaud you for being willing to wrestle with it. And we'll finish off this handout next week, and then we'll see if we'll get the new material next week or not. But thanks for doing some footwork on this. And Bud, I applaud you for having the time to do some research on it. So it's really good.
It's interesting, you know, trying to delve into it and see how the connection is with history. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
And of course, with the internet, you can go bananas on that. There's just so much material out there, and you're trying to figure out what's good stuff, what's not so good, and
Right. Yeah, it's a deep hole that you can go into, you know.
Yeah.
You can just keep going farther and farther when you cross-reference stuff with other you know, other websites or whatever. You're right.
This has really made me stop and think. At Ohio State, he had a professor who was Ivy Orthodox,
no, it was conservative, I think.
very, very conservative anyway. But their last of 3 children was a little girl, and they named her Esther.
Uh-huh.
And I was assuming they named her after Esther in the Bible here because of
Right.
how conservative they are. But now this other take, especially when you come in with, was she moral? Makes me wonder.
Well, my dear wife, of whom I'm going to be married to this Friday for 38 years.
We're 45.
I know. It's not a comparison, but she was named after Esther.
Oh, really? I didn't realize.
Yeah. So Estera, Estera, is the Croatian spelling of Esther.
Yeah.
So, yep. Now she's regretting that she's named. No, I'm just kidding. That I'm gonna change my name. Yeah. I don't think so. Let me kind of touch on that this Sunday. Okay. What Mark asks is, do I think that the 75,000 is symbolic? I think it's exaggeration is what I think it is, but I don't want to give away this Sunday's sermon. Okay, but I don't think that's an actual. No, I don't think that's an actual number. So, but anyway, yeah, right. All right, folks, we'll. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah, they're kibitzing about how they think all those 75,000 died as Mark drinks his Kool-Aid.
Well, you know, the other thing is that you know, the duration over which that occurred, I mean, it could have been actually longer. I mean, 6 million people, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So,
yeah,
from the standpoint of numbers, you think that's an incredible number. I mean,
That is,
obviously,
yeah.
horrible number. And so you put that in the context, if in fact, maybe it wasn't one day, maybe it was over a period of months, or something, or
Yeah.
weeks or months, it becomes a little more feasible perhaps, but
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, those are all things to consider in the process. But I'll give you my thoughts on chapter 9 on Sunday. So,
Okay,
okay.
thank you.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. We'll see you.
You
on
too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.